The drive to Ravenswood was longer than Vanessa expected. The town was tucked away in a forested corner of the country, nearly forgotten by modern maps. The road leading there was narrow and overgrown, and her GPS flickered uncertainly, recalibrating every few minutes as if reluctant to guide her to her destination. Vanessa Reed was a journalist for True Mysteries Weekly, a magazine teetering between hard-hitting investigative reporting and tabloid sensationalism. Her editor, Sam, had shoved a crumpled letter into her hands a week ago. "This came in the mail," he'd said, grinning. "A tip. You like weird stories, right?" The letter was written in a tight, shaky script. "There's a town where the sun shines, but no shadows fall. Come to Ravenswood if you want to know the truth." Vanessa thought it was a hoax, but Sam, always chasing the next viral headline, insisted she follow it. "Even if it's fake, it's creepy enough to sell a few issues," he had said. Now, as the dense woods swallowed the road, Vanessa wasn't so sure it was a waste of time. There was an unnatural stillness to the air, as though the world was holding its breath. The trees loomed tall and dark, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. Finally, the road broke into an open clearing, and Vanessa caught her first glimpse of Ravenswood. The town was small, almost picturesque in its quaintness. Victorian-style houses with steep roofs and wooden shutters lined the streets. A single church spire rose above the skyline, its weathered cross gleaming faintly in the sunlight. But something was off. Vanessa parked her car at the edge of the town square and stepped out. She turned in a slow circle, taking in her surroundings. The sunlight was bright and sharp, yet there were no shadows. Not under the buildings, not beneath the trees, not even at her own feet. Her breath hitched. "That's not possible," she murmured. She walked toward the nearest building, her boots crunching on gravel. She bent down, holding her hand out to cast a shadow on the wall. Nothing. The light seemed to devour it, leaving only a strange, flat brightness behind. A cold shiver ran down her spine. "Excuse me, miss," a voice called out behind her. Vanessa turned to see a man standing by the entrance to the general store. He was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face. He wore a plaid shirt tucked into faded jeans, his hands tucked into his pockets. "You're new," he said, more a statement than a question. "Just visiting," Vanessa replied, forcing a smile. "I'm a journalist." "Vanessa Reed." The man's expression tightened at the word journalist. He glanced around nervously before stepping closer. "Not many folks come to Ravenswood," he said in a low voice, "especially not outsiders." "Well, I heard about the, She hesitated, unsure how to phrase it without sounding ridiculous. "The shadow thing. Thought it might make for an interesting story." The man's face darkened. He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Be careful what you dig up, Miss Reed. Some truths are better left buried." Before Vanessa could respond, he walked away, his boots clicking against the cobblestones. She watched him disappear around a corner, the unsettling weight of his warning lingering in the air. Shaking off the unease, Vanessa headed toward the center of town. A weathered sign above a small cafe read Larkspur Diner. She stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly. The interior was as quaint as the rest of the town, with red vinyl booths and a long counter lined with chrome stools. A few locals were scattered throughout, sipping coffee and murmuring in low voices. They all stopped and stared as she entered. Vanessa offered a polite nod and slid into a booth near the window. "What'll it be?" a waitress asked, appearing almost immediately. She was young, with strawberry blonde hair tied back in a ponytail. Her name tag read Ellie. "Just coffee," Vanessa said, her voice tight. Ellie nodded and disappeared behind the counter. Vanessa glanced around, acutely aware of the weight of the other patrons' stares. When Ellie returned with the coffee, Vanessa decided to break the silence. "So, Ellie," she began casually, "what's the deal with this town? No shadows, huh?" Ellie froze, her eyes darting toward the other customers. For a moment, Vanessa thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a hushed tone, Ellie said, "You shouldn't be asking about that." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Why not? It's not like it's a secret." Ellie hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. People here don't like to talk about it. It's complicated. Before Vanessa could press her, the door to the diner creaked open. The atmosphere shifted instantly. A tall man in a dark suit entered, his presence commanding the room. His hair was slicked back, and his sharp features seemed carved from stone. He walked with a deliberate, almost predatory grace. Ellie paled. "Who's that?" Vanessa whispered. "Mr. Grayson," Ellie murmured, clutching her tray tightly. "He's one of the elders." Vanessa watched as Mr. Grayson scanned the room, his piercing eyes lingering on her. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face, and he made his way to her booth. "Miss Reed," he said smoothly, his voice deep and velvety. "Welcome to Ravenswood." Vanessa stiffened. "How do you know my name?" Grayson chuckled. "We don't get many visitors. Word travels fast in a town like this." He slid into the booth across from her, his presence suffocating. "I hear you're here to write a story," he said, folding his hands neatly on the table. "About our unique little town." Vanessa nodded cautiously. "That's right. I'm interested in the phenomenon here. No shadows. Seems like a big mystery." Grayson's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. "Some mysteries, Miss Reed, are not meant to be solved." The words sent a chill down Vanessa's spine. She opened her mouth to respond, but Grayson stood abruptly. "Enjoy your stay," he said, tipping his hat, "but tread carefully. Ravenswood isn't kind to those who pry." He turned and left the diner, the door swinging shut behind him. Vanessa sat in stunned silence, her coffee growing cold. Whatever was happening in this town, it was clear the people were terrified of it, and of him. She glanced out the window, watching as the sunlight bathed the streets in an unnatural glow, unbroken by shadows. Her instincts as a journalist told her she was onto something big, but her gut told her to get out while she still could. For now, she chose to ignore her gut. Vanessa reached for her phone to take notes, but when she looked at her reflection in the screen, her heart stopped. There was no shadow behind her, and her reflection smiled. Vanessa bolted upright in her seat, her phone slipping from her hands and clattering onto the table. She stared at it, her pulse thundering in her ears. Her reflection was gone now, leaving only the darkened screen. "Get a grip, Reed," she whispered, trying to steady her trembling hands. But the moment wouldn't leave her mind. That smile, it wasn't hers. Ellie reappeared, clutching the coffee pot, her face pale. "You all right?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Vanessa nodded quickly, forcing a strained smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired from the drive." Ellie hesitated, then leaned closer. "If you're smart, you'll leave before dark. Ravenswood isn't a place for strangers." Vanessa narrowed her eyes. "Why? What happens after dark?" Ellie flinched, glancing toward the window. The golden afternoon light stretched over the square, bathing the town in its eerie, shadowless glow. "Just take my advice," Ellie said, her voice low. "Go. Tonight." Before Vanessa could press her further, the bell above the diner door rang, and a group of locals entered, their loud chatter cutting through the tension. Ellie straightened abruptly and scurried away, leaving Vanessa with more questions than answers. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Vanessa decided to check out the town's library. If there was a strange history here, surely the records would hold some clue. The library was a small, squat building near the edge of town, its stone facade covered in creeping ivy. Inside, the scent of old paper and wood polish hung in the air, and a heavy silence pressed against her ears. Behind the counter sat a hunched, elderly woman with thin, gray hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore thick glasses that magnified her watery blue eyes. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice creaky like an old floorboard. Vanessa introduced herself and explained she was researching the town's unique phenomenon. The librarian's expression tightened, but she nodded toward the back of the room. "Local history section," she said curtly. Vanessa walked to the indicated shelves, her fingers trailing along the spines of dusty books. The titles ranged from mundane, Ravenswood's founding, A Pioneer's Tale, to more intriguing entries like the Shadowless Curse. She pulled the latter from the shelf, her heart pounding as she flipped through its brittle pages. The book was a collection of folklore, written in a dense, almost poetic style. One passage caught her eye. In the year 1887, the people of Ravenswood made a pact beneath the blood moon, a promise sealed with light and fire, traded for prosperity. But the light casts no shadow, and the pact demands its price. Vanessa frowned. The language was cryptic, but the mention of a pact felt significant. What price? She muttered to herself. As she read on, the text described how the townspeople had been plagued by hardship, famine, disease, and failing crops. Desperate, they turned to an unnamed benefactor, who promised them wealth and safety in exchange for an unspecified sacrifice. The last line sent a chill down her spine. Beware the light that betrays the dark, for it is not the sun that shines. Find what you were looking for, a deep voice interrupted. Vanessa jumped, clutching the book to her chest. Turning, she found herself face to face with Mr. Grayson. His dark suit was immaculate, and his sharp features were as unreadable as ever. She faltered. I'm just doing research. Grayson tilted his head, his piercing gaze pinning her in place. You should be careful about the stories you dig into, Miss Reed. Some histories are better left undisturbed. Vanessa straightened, refusing to let him intimidate her. If there's something dangerous here, don't you think people have a right to know? Grayson's lips curled into a faint smile. Dangerous? No. Ravenswood is perfectly safe. For those who follow the rules. Before she could question him further, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing ominously in the quiet library. Vanessa exhaled shakily, clutching the book tighter. Something about Grayson set every nerve in her body on edge. She checked the book out and hurried back to her car, her thoughts racing. Vanessa decided to stay the night in the town's only inn, a creaky old house converted into a modest bed and breakfast. The owner, Mrs. Finch, was a kindly woman with a perpetually worried expression. As Vanessa unpacked her things, she noticed a large window that overlooked the town square. The light outside had shifted, growing dimmer as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The shadows were still absent, even as the golden light deepened to orange. The book sat on the nightstand, its title glinting faintly in the fading light. Vanessa flipped it open again, rereading the passage about the pact. Her mind wandered back to the townspeople, their nervous glances and cryptic warnings. And then there was Grayson, who seemed to hold some unspoken authority over them all. Why were they so afraid? As darkness began to creep in, a sound broke the silence. A faint, rhythmic tapping. Vanessa froze, her ears straining. The tapping came again, louder this time. She crossed the room to the window, peering out into the square. First, she saw nothing. The streets were empty, bathed in the eerie, shadowless glow of the street lamps. Then she saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the square, motionless. Its shape was indistinct, as though blurred around the edges. Vanessa's breath hitched. The figure turned its head slowly, as if sensing her gaze. Though its face was featureless, she felt its attention lock onto her, cold and unrelenting. The tapping sound came again, louder now. It wasn't coming from outside. It was behind her. Vanessa spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The room was empty. She backed toward the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the light switch. The tapping grew more insistent, echoing through the room. It was coming from the mirror above the dresser. Vanessa turned slowly, her eyes wide with terror. The mirror was no longer reflecting her room. Instead, it showed a dark, endless void. And from within that void, something moved. A hand, pale and clawed, reached out, tapping against the glass. Vanessa stumbled backward. Her scream lodged in her throat as the hand pressed harder, the glass warping as though it were about to shatter. The lights flickered, and the air grew icy cold. Then, with a deafening crack, the mirror splintered. Vanessa bolted from the room, her mind reeling as she raced down the hall. She didn't stop until she was outside, gasping for breath in the open air. The town square was still and silent, but her heart pounded with the certainty that she wasn't alone. Somewhere in the darkness the figure watched, and she had the sinking feeling that she had just scratched the surface of Ravenswood's horrifying secret. Vanessa didn't sleep that night. She sat in the tiny lobby of the bed and breakfast, clutching the ancient book she had taken from the library. Mrs. Finch, the innkeeper, had offered her tea, but Vanessa barely touched it. The faint chiming of a grandfather clock marked each passing hour, a constant reminder of the time slipping by. Her mind replayed the events in her room. The tapping, the clawed hand, the shattering mirror. The image of the faceless figure standing in the square wouldn't leave her. As dawn broke, washing the town in its unnatural, shadowless light, Vanessa knew one thing for certain. She couldn't leave. Not yet. Whatever was happening in Ravenswood wasn't just a local oddity or an unexplained phenomenon. It was darker, deeper, and she had to know the truth. Vanessa stepped out into the square, the air cool and unnervingly still. The streets were empty, save for the occasional distant figure scurrying from one building to another. The shattered mirror in her room had been cleaned up before she returned. Mrs. Finch had refused to comment on it, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was as if the townsfolk had an unspoken rule: pretend nothing is wrong. Vanessa's destination was clear: the church at the center of town. The spire loomed above the other buildings, its weathered stone catching the morning light. If there was any place in Ravenswood that might hold answers, it was there. The heavy wooden doors creaked as Vanessa pushed them open. Inside, the air was cool and carried the faint scent of incense. Rows of wooden pews stretched toward an altar adorned with flickering candles. An elderly man in a dark robe emerged from a side room, his gait slow but steady. His eyes were sharp, contrasting with his frail frame. "Good morning," he said, his voice rasping. "You must be the visitor everyone's whispering about." Vanessa approached cautiously. "I'm Vanessa Reed. I'm here to learn about the town." The man gave a knowing nod. "I am Father Elias, the caretaker of this house of worship. But if you're searching for answers, Miss Reed, they won't come easy." Vanessa glanced around the dim interior. "I think Ravenswood's history is more than just folklore. The pact, what do you know about it?" Father Elias froze, his expression hardening. "You've been reading the wrong books. Or the right ones," Vanessa countered. For a moment, the old priest seemed to weigh his response. Finally, he gestured for her to sit in a pew. "When Ravenswood was young," Elias began, his voice low, "it was a town of struggle. The land was unforgiving, the winters harsh. People here were desperate. Desperation leads to dangerous choices." Vanessa leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "What kind of choices?" Father Elias's gaze grew distant, as if he were seeing something far away. "They say a stranger came to town one night, a man who promised salvation. He could make the crops grow, banish disease, bring prosperity to every home. But he required something in return." Vanessa's breath hitched. "What was the price?" Elias shook his head. "The elders made the decision. They agreed to his terms, sealing the pact under a blood moon. And while the stranger kept his promise, the cost was greater than they imagined." "Shadows," Vanessa whispered. Father Elias nodded grimly. "The pact took more than their shadows, took their souls. Without shadows, they lost their connection to the divine balance of light and dark. They became prisoners of the light, unable to hide from its gaze." Vanessa shivered. "And the stranger?" "He still walks among us," Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Watching, waiting, ensuring no one breaks the rules." Vanessa felt a chill creep down her spine. "Grayson," she said, the name falling from her lips like a curse. Elias's eyes narrowed. "Be wary of him. He's not what he seems." The priest stood abruptly, his frail hands gripping the edge of the pew. "You should leave, Miss Reed. The deeper you dig, the harder it will be to escape." But Vanessa wasn't ready to leave. "What happens to outsiders?" she asked. Father Elias paused, his expression darkening. "Most never leave. Some vanish. Others," his voice trailed off, but the haunted look in his eyes spoke volumes. As Vanessa left the church, her mind churned with questions. The townsfolk's fear, the eerie silence, the figure in the square. All of it seemed connected to this pact. But one thing stood out. If Grayson was tied to the pact, confronting him might be the only way to get answers. Vanessa didn't have to wait long. As she stepped into the square, Grayson was there, leaning casually against a lamppost. His dark suit was immaculate, and his smile was as cold as ever. "Miss Reed," he called out, his voice smooth and unhurried. "Enjoying your stay?" Vanessa squared her shoulders. "I'm learning a lot about your town." Grayson chuckled, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. "I thought you might. You have the air of someone who doesn't back down easily. Admirable but dangerous." "I want to know the truth," Vanessa said firmly. "What's really going on here? What is this pact?" Grayson's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "The truth, Miss Reed, is not for everyone. But perhaps," he tilted his head, considering her, "perhaps you'd like to see for yourself." Vanessa hesitated. "See what?" "Tonight," Grayson said, his voice taking on a sinister edge. "Come to the edge of the woods, just beyond the town. Midnight. I'll show you what you seek." Every instinct in Vanessa's body screamed at her to refuse, but her curiosity burned brighter than her fear. "I'll be there," she said, her voice steady. Grayson's smile turned razor-sharp. "Good. I look forward to it." Vanessa stood at the edge of the woods. The town behind her bathed in its unearthly glow. The trees loomed ahead, their branches twisting into a canopy that blocked out the sky. Grayson emerged from the shadows, his movements unervingly smooth. "Right on time," he said, his voice like silk. Vanessa crossed her arms. "What are you going to show me?" Grayson gestured toward the forest. "The truth. But once you see it, there's no turning back." With that, he turned and strode into the woods. Vanessa hesitated only a moment before following. The forest was unnaturally silent, the air heavy with an oppressive stillness. As they walked, Grayson spoke. "Ravenswood is a town of balance, Miss Reed. A balance paid for by sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" she demanded. Grayson stopped abruptly, turning to face her. His expression was unreadable. "You'll see." They entered a clearing, and Vanessa's breath caught. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone altar, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight. And surrounding the altar were figures, shadows, black as night, twisting and writhing like living things. Vanessa's heart pounded as she took a step closer. The shadows moved toward her, reaching, hungry. Grayson's voice cut through the silence. "Welcome to the heart of Ravenswood, Miss Reed. This is where the light ends." The clearing felt alive, pulsing with an unnatural energy that crawled under Vanessa's skin. The stone altar glistened faintly, the etched symbols seeming to pulse in rhythm with her racing heart. The air around her felt dense, suffocating, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Grayson stood at the edge of the clearing, his figure stark against the chaotic dance of the shadows. They coiled and twisted like serpents, their movements unnatural, defying logic. "You're afraid," he said, his voice smooth and cold. Vanessa tried to steel herself, her fists clenched at her sides. "What are they?" Grayson tilted his head, a thin smile playing on his lips. "They're what remains of those who came before. The price of the pact." Vanessa's stomach churned as the realization hit her. The townspeople. They gave up their shadows? Grayson chuckled darkly. "Not just their shadows, their essence. The shadows you see here are hollow echoes of what they once were, left behind to ensure the balance is maintained." Vanessa took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run. But something rooted her in place. Curiosity, defiance, or perhaps the pull of the very darkness that surrounded her. "What balance?" she demanded. Grayson's smile faded, replaced by an expression of quiet menace. "The balance between light and dark. Without shadows, the light consumes everything. The pact ensures the town's prosperity, but the cost is eternal vigilance. And every so often," he paused, his gaze locking onto hers. A new sacrifice is required. Vanessa's blood ran cold. Sacrifice? For what? Grayson gestured toward the altar. To keep the pact alive. The shadows began to shift, their movements growing more erratic. They stretched and elongated, their dark forms reaching toward Vanessa like smoke caught in a gust of wind. Grayson watched her with an almost clinical interest, his eyes glinting in the dim light. They can sense you. They're drawn to your light. Vanessa stumbled back as one of the shadows surged forward, its tendrils brushing against her arm. The sensation was icy, like a deep winter chill piercing straight to her bones. "Stop this!" she shouted, her voice trembling. Grayson raised a hand, and the shadows froze in place, retreating slightly but still writhing hungrily. "You wanted the truth, Miss Reed. This is it. Ravenswood thrives because of this pact. Without it, the town would wither and die." Vanessa shook her head, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "This isn't survival. It's slavery." Grayson's lips curled into a thin smile. "Call it what you will. But without the pact, none of us would be here." Grayson began to circle the altar, his presence commanding, his movements deliberate. "Years ago," he said, "the townsfolk called upon the stranger under a blood moon, desperate for salvation. He promised them prosperity, and he delivered. The crops grew, the sickness vanished, and the people flourished." "But," Vanessa interjected, "they didn't know what they were agreeing to." Grayson stopped, his gaze piercing. "They knew enough. They understood the cost, even if they refused to acknowledge it." Vanessa's hands trembled as she took another step back. "Why are you telling me this? Why bring me here?" Grayson's smile returned, sharp and cruel. "Because the pact requires fresh blood. And you, Miss Reed, are an outsider, perfectly positioned to ensure Ravenswood's continued prosperity." Her heart sank as the weight of his words settled over her. "You brought me here to sacrifice me?" Grayson shrugged. "Sacrifice is a strong word. Think of it as fulfilling your purpose." Vanessa's instincts screamed at her to run, but the shadows began to shift again, their dark tendrils moving to block her escape. Vanessa's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of panic and determination. She refused to be a pawn in their twisted game. "What happens if the pact is broken?" she asked, trying to buy time. Grayson's expression darkened. "The town falls, the light fades, and the darkness consumes everything." Vanessa looked around, her gaze locking onto the symbols etched into the altar. They glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. An idea began to form, desperate and reckless. "What if I don't agree?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. Grayson's smile returned, colder than ever. "It's not about agreement, Miss Reed. The pact doesn't require consent. Only presence." The shadows surged toward her, their movements frenzied. Vanessa acted on instinct, grabbing a large branch from the forest floor and swinging it wildly. The branch passed through the shadows, scattering them momentarily but doing little to stop their advance. Grayson watched her struggle, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Futile," he said. But Vanessa wasn't ready to give up. She turned her attention to the altar, her gaze narrowing on the glowing symbols. "What happens if the altar is destroyed?" she asked, her voice shaking. Grayson's eyes widened, the first hint of unease crossing his face. "Don't." Vanessa took a step closer to the altar, her heart pounding. The shadows recoiled slightly, as if sensing her intent. "You're lying," she said, her voice rising. "The pact doesn't protect the town. Traps it. And you're the one keeping it alive." Grayson's calm demeanor shattered, his voice booming across the clearing. "You don't know what you're doing." Vanessa ignored him, raising the branch high above her head. The shadows screamed, their inhuman wails filling the air as she brought the branch down onto the altar with all her strength. The moment the branch struck the stone, the glowing symbols flared brightly, blinding her. A deafening crack echoed through the clearing as the altar split down the middle, its pieces collapsing to the ground. The shadows writhed and convulsed, their forms unraveling like smoke caught in a storm. Grayson stumbled back, his face contorted in rage and fear. "What have you done?" he bellowed, his voice echoing unnaturally. Vanessa shielded her eyes from the blinding light, her heart racing. The oppressive energy in the clearing began to dissipate, replaced by an eerie stillness. When the light faded, the shadows were gone. Grayson stood at the edge of the clearing, his figure flickering like a dying flame. His eyes burned with fury as he pointed a trembling finger at Vanessa. "You've doomed us all," he hissed, his voice distorted and hollow. Before Vanessa could respond, Grayson's form dissolved into nothingness, leaving her alone in the silent clearing. The forest seemed to exhale, the tension lifting as the unnatural stillness gave way to the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. Vanessa fell to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The weight of what she had done pressed heavily on her chest. But as she looked up at the shattered altar, she couldn't help but wonder if she had truly broken the curse, or unleashed something far worse. Vanessa sat in the clearing, her body trembling as the enormity of what she had done began to sink in. The broken altar lay before her, its shattered pieces strewn across the forest floor. The air was different now, lighter perhaps, but not in a comforting way. Felt wrong. The shadows were gone, but the oppressive stillness that had defined Ravenswood had been replaced with something darker. The natural world seemed to hold its breath, as if bracing for what was to come. Vanessa rose to her feet, her legs unsteady. She needed answers, but the only person who might have them had disappeared. Grayson's final words echoed in her mind. "You've doomed us all." Her journalist instincts warred with her survival instincts. She had come to Ravenswood to uncover a story, but now she was part of it. And it wasn't over yet. Vanessa emerged from the forest just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The town looked the same as before, quiet, shadowless, unervingly pristine. But there was a tension in the air, a charged unease that set her nerves on edge. As she walked through the streets, she noticed the townsfolk. They stood in small groups, whispering to one another, their faces pale and drawn. Their eyes followed her as she passed, a mixture of fear and suspicion flickering in their gazes. Mrs. Finch was waiting for her at the bed and breakfast, her expression grim. "You've stirred something you don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Vanessa stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "The shadows are gone. The pact is broken." Mrs. Finch shook her head, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the counter. "You think breaking the altar ended the curse? You've only unleashed what it was holding back." "What do you mean?" Vanessa demanded. "The pact wasn't just a deal," Mrs. Finch said, her voice rising in urgency. "It was a barrier, kept the darkness contained. Without it," she trailed off, her gaze darting to the window. "It's free now." Vanessa's chest tightened. "What's free?" Mrs. Finch's eyes filled with tears. "You'll see. When the light fades." That night, Ravenswood changed. It started with the lights. One by one, the streetlights in the town square began to flicker and die. The glow that had always bathed the town dimmed, leaving the streets shrouded in an unnatural twilight. Vanessa watched from her window, her pulse quickening as she saw people running through the streets, their faces twisted in panic. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing moment. It was a sound Vanessa felt in her bones, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Then came the screams. Vanessa grabbed her bag, stuffing it with her notebook and the ancient book she had taken from the library. She couldn't stay in the bed and breakfast, not when something was happening outside. She stepped into the street, the cool night air heavy with tension. The townsfolk were fleeing toward the church, their faces pale and stricken with fear. Vanessa grabbed a passing woman by the arm. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice shaking. The woman shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "They're coming." Vanessa let her go, her stomach churning. The darkness came first, rolling in like a thick, impenetrable fog. It swallowed the streets, consuming the light and plunging the town into an eerie gloom. And then the shadows returned. They weren't the same as before. These shadows were darker, more solid, their forms shifting and writhing like living creatures. They moved with purpose, creeping along the ground and walls, their edges razor-sharp. Vanessa stumbled back as one of the shadows surged toward her, its tendrils reaching out hungrily. She ducked into an alley, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she pressed herself against the wall. From her hiding spot, she watched as the shadows claimed the town. They seeped into buildings, slithered through doorways, and enveloped anyone who stood in their path. The screams of the townsfolk were muffled, swallowed by the darkness. Vanessa gripped her bag tightly, her mind racing. She had broken the altar, released the shadows. If she didn't find a way to stop them, Ravenswood and everyone in it would be consumed. Vanessa made her way to the church, its spire barely visible against the darkened sky. The massive wooden doors were open, and the faint glow of candlelight spilled out onto the steps. Inside, the townsfolk huddled together, their faces pale and drawn. Father Elias stood at the altar, his expression grave as he spoke in hushed tones. Vanessa pushed her way through the crowd, her voice rising above the murmurs. "Father Elias." The priest looked up, his eyes narrowing as he saw her. "You shouldn't have come here." "I need answers," Vanessa said, her voice firm. "What's happening? How do we stop it?" Father Elias hesitated, his gaze flicking to the townsfolk before returning to Vanessa. "You've broken the pact. The darkness that was bound by the altar is free now. Cannot be stopped." "There has to be a way," Vanessa insisted. Elias sighed, his shoulders sagging. The altar was a seal, a barrier forged by the pact. Without it, the darkness will consume everything. Vanessa opened her bag, pulling out the ancient book. "This has to have something. There's always a way to fight back." Elias's eyes widened as he saw the book. "Where did you get that?" "The library," Vanessa said. "It's full of symbols and rituals. There has to be something we can use." Elias stepped forward, his hands trembling as he took the book. He flipped through the pages, his expression growing more alarmed with each passing moment. "This is forbidden knowledge," he said, his voice shaking. "It was never meant to be used." Vanessa's patience snapped. "If it can stop this, then we have to use it." Elias hesitated, his gaze darting to the frightened townsfolk. Finally, he nodded. "There is one ritual, but it is dangerous. And the cost," he trailed off, his face pale. "What cost?" Vanessa demanded. Elias met her gaze, his eyes filled with sorrow. "A life for a life. The darkness can be sealed again, but only if someone offers themselves willingly." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy shroud. Vanessa's heart pounded as she realized what he was saying. To save the town, someone would have to die. Vanessa stood frozen in the candlelit church, Father Elias's words reverberating in her mind. "A life for a life." The gathered townsfolk stared at her, their expressions a mixture of fear, desperation, and silent accusation. No one spoke, but their collective gaze was heavy with expectation. Vanessa was the outsider. She had broken the altar. She had brought this upon them. Vanessa's hands curled into fists at her sides. "There has to be another way." Father Elias shook his head, his face lined with sorrow. "The darkness is an ancient force, cannot be fought or reasoned with. Only a blood sacrifice can seal it again." The church trembled as if the very walls were reacting to his words. Outside, the shadows pressed against the stained glass windows, their writhing forms casting grotesque silhouettes in the flickering light. "Why me?" Vanessa asked, her voice trembling. "Why does it have to be me?" Elias met her gaze, his eyes filled with a quiet resignation. "Because the pact was broken by your hand. The darkness will only accept the one who unraveled its binding." The crowd murmured uneasily, their voices rising in a chaotic blend of fear and anger. "She's the reason this is happening," someone shouted. "She should pay the price," another cried. Vanessa's heart raced as the room erupted into chaos. She backed away, her mind racing. She had come to Ravenswood seeking a story, but she had found a nightmare. "This isn't my fault," she yelled, her voice cutting through the clamor. "I didn't know what the altar was." I was trying to help. Enough! Father Elias's voice boomed, silencing the crowd. He turned to Vanessa, his expression firm. The darkness is already claiming the town. If we do not act, it will consume everything. Vanessa felt a lump rise in her throat. The shadows outside seemed to grow more aggressive, their tendrils probing the edges of the church as if testing its defenses. There has to be another way, she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias sighed, his gaze softening. There may be, but it would require great courage, and an even greater risk. Vanessa straightened, desperation giving her strength. Tell me. Elias led Vanessa to the altar at the front of the church, where the ancient book lay open. The pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams, their meaning inscrutable. There is a ritual, Elias began, tracing his finger along the faded text. It is said to banish the darkness without a sacrifice, but it has never been attempted. The consequences are unknown. Vanessa leaned over the book, her eyes scanning the symbols. The text spoke of summoning the light, a force powerful enough to push back the darkness. But the ritual was complex, requiring precise steps and a deep connection to the town's history. What do I have to do? She asked, her voice steady. Elias hesitated, his expression troubled. The light must be called forth by someone pure of heart, untainted by the pact. But it will test you. If your resolve falters, he trailed off, his meaning clear. Vanessa swallowed hard. I'll do it. Elias studied her for a long moment before nodding. Very well. But we must act quickly. The darkness is growing stronger. The ritual required preparation. Elias gathered candles, incense, and other ceremonial tools, while Vanessa memorized the incantation. The words felt foreign on her tongue, their meaning elusive, but she repeated them over and over until they became second nature. The townsfolk watched from the pews, their fear palpable. Some whispered prayers, while others wept silently. Vanessa could feel their eyes on her, their hope pinned on her success or failure. Outside, the shadows pressed harder against the church, their movements frenzied. The glass panes began to crack under the strain, spiderweb fractures spreading across the surface. We're running out of time, Elias said, lighting the last of the candles. Vanessa stepped into the center of the altar, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. She felt the weight of the book in her hands, its leather cover worn and smooth. Begin the incantation, Elias instructed, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Vanessa took a deep breath and began to chant. The words felt heavy, as if they carried a power she could barely comprehend. The air around her grew thick, charged with energy, and the candles flared brighter. The shadows outside seemed to sense the ritual. They surged against the church with renewed fury, their inhuman wails piercing the night. The stained glass shattered, and the darkness poured into the sanctuary like a flood. The townsfolk screamed, scattering in all directions. The shadows moved with terrifying speed, their tendrils snaking through the pews, searching for prey. Elias shouted over the chaos. Keep chanting. Don't stop. No matter what happens. Vanessa's voice wavered but did not falter. She closed her eyes, focusing on the words as the darkness closed in around her. The ritual's energy built with each syllable, a golden light beginning to emanate from the altar. The shadows recoiled, hissing as the light grew stronger. But they didn't retreat. Instead, they pressed forward, their forms becoming more solid, more monstrous. One of the shadows lunged at Vanessa, its clawed tendrils reaching for her throat. She flinched, her voice faltering for a split second. The golden light flickered. No! Elias shouted, stepping between her and the shadow. He raised a cross, its surface glowing with a faint light. The shadow shrieked and retreated, but Elias staggered, his face pale. They're testing you, he said, his voice strained. You mustn't give in to fear. Vanessa nodded, her resolve hardening. She resumed the chant, her voice louder and steadier. The golden light surged, filling the church and forcing the shadows back. The ritual neared its climax, the light radiating from the altar growing blindingly bright. Vanessa felt a surge of hope. She could do this. She could end the darkness. But then the light began to change. It turned from gold to a harsh, searing white, and Vanessa felt a sharp pain in her chest. The book in her hands grew unbearably hot, and she dropped it with a cry. The light dimmed slightly, flickering like a dying flame. "Stay strong," Elias shouted, his voice barely audible over the rising roar of the shadows. Vanessa gritted her teeth, her hands trembling as she picked up the book. The pain was overwhelming, but she forced herself to continue. As the final words of the incantation left her lips, the light exploded outward, filling the church and spilling into the streets. The shadows screamed, their forms disintegrating in the brilliant glow. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the light faded, and Vanessa collapsed to the floor, the book slipping from her hands. Vanessa's vision swam as she blinked against the lingering afterimage of the searing light. Her body ached as if she'd been wrung out and left to dry. The hard stone of the church floor pressed against her back, its coldness seeping into her skin. For a moment, she thought she was alone. Then, the low murmur of voices reached her ears. Vanessa forced herself to sit up, her limbs trembling with the effort. The townsfolk were gathered near the shattered windows, their faces pale and drawn. The shadows were gone, but the oppressive silence that hung over the town was worse than their wails. "Did it work?" Vanessa croaked, her voice rasping from the strain of the ritual. Father Elias knelt beside her, his expression grim. "The shadows are gone, but something else has taken their place." Vanessa's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Elias didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the doorway of the church. Vanessa followed his gaze, her heart pounding as she noticed the strange glow outside. The streets of Ravenswood were bathed in an eerie, otherworldly light. It wasn't the warm glow of the sun or the flicker of street lamps. This light was unnatural, pale, cold, and unrelenting. Vanessa rose unsteadily to her feet, leaning on Elias for support. Together they stepped outside. Ravenswood was unrecognizable. The buildings looked sharper, their edges unnaturally defined as if etched by an unseen hand. The air felt heavy, crackling with unseen energy. But it was the people that unsettled Vanessa the most. The townsfolk who had fled the church now stood frozen in the streets, their faces turned skyward. Their eyes were wide, their mouths slightly open as if caught mid-sentence. "They're not moving," Vanessa whispered, a chill running down her spine. Elias's hand tightened on her arm. "They're not the only ones." Vanessa's gaze followed his pointing finger to the horizon. The forest that had once surrounded Ravenswood was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of gray mist. The world itself seemed to have shrunk, as if the town were the last bastion of existence. "We've entered their domain," Elias said, his voice heavy with dread. Vanessa turned to him, her heart racing. "Whose domain?" "The ones the pact was meant to keep at bay," Elias replied. "The shadows were only their messengers. The true power lies beyond." Determined to find answers, Vanessa and Elias returned to the church. The ancient book still lay on the altar, its pages glowing faintly in the strange light. Vanessa flipped through it, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. As she read, fragments of the town's history began to emerge. Ravenswood's pact with the shadows had been forged centuries ago to protect the town from a greater threat, a nameless force that sought to consume all light and life. The pact had required sacrifices, but it had kept the greater darkness at bay. By breaking the altar, Vanessa had not only unleashed the shadows, but also weakened the barrier that separated Ravenswood from the void. "There has to be a way to fix this," Vanessa said, her voice shaking. Elias pointed to a passage in the book. "There's a ritual, final one, but it requires a key." "What kind of key?" Vanessa asked. Elias hesitated. "A link to the pact, a relic that holds the essence of the agreement. Without it, the ritual won't work." Vanessa's mind raced. She had seen relics in the library's hidden room, artifacts steeped in the town's dark history. If the key existed, it had to be there. "I'll go," she said, determination hardening her voice. Elias's expression darkened. The library is no longer what it was. That place will be crawling with them. Vanessa squared her shoulders. I don't have a choice. Vanessa approached the library with a mixture of trepidation and resolve. The building stood untouched, its facade eerily pristine. But the moment she stepped inside, the air changed. The silence was absolute, the kind that pressed against her ears and made her chest tighten. The once familiar shelves seemed taller, their shadows stretching unnaturally toward the ceiling. Clutching a flashlight, Vanessa navigated the aisles, her footsteps echoing in the oppressive stillness. She reached the hidden room without incident, but as she pushed open the door, a wave of nausea washed over her. The room had transformed. The artifacts and relics now floated in the air, suspended by invisible threads. The walls pulsed with a faint light, and the air felt electric. Vanessa's eyes landed on a small, ornate box hovering at the center of the room. Its surface was etched with the same symbols she had seen in the book. That has to be it, she muttered, stepping forward. As she reached for the box, a low growl echoed through the room. Vanessa froze, her blood running cold. From the shadows emerged a figure, a towering, humanoid shape with no discernible features. Its body was composed of shifting darkness, and its eyes burned like twin suns. Vanessa's hand hovered over the box as the creature advanced. She could feel its malice, its hunger, like a physical force pressing against her. Her fingers closed around the box, and the creature lunged. Vanessa darted out of the room, clutching the box to her chest. The creature's enraged roar shook the library, its footsteps thunderous as it pursued her. She zigzagged through the aisles, her flashlight flickering as if the batteries were dying. The creature was faster, its form distorting and reappearing in front of her, forcing her to change direction. Vanessa burst through the library doors and into the strange light of the town. The creature followed, its form towering over the buildings as it roared in fury. Elias was waiting for her outside the church, his face pale. "Did you get it?" he yelled. Vanessa thrust the box into his hands, gasping for breath. "Now what?" Elias opened the box, revealing a small crystal that pulsed with a faint, golden light. "We perform the ritual," he said. "Here and now." The creature loomed behind them, its shadow stretching across the ground like a living thing. Vanessa stood frozen as Elias chanted the opening lines of the ritual. The crystal in his hands glowed brighter, its golden light intensifying as if resisting its purpose. The towering creature of shadows edged closer, its form unraveling and reassembling like a nightmarish mirage. "Vanessa!" Elias's voice broke through her daze. "We must begin. Place your hands on the crystal." She hesitated, the weight of her choice pressing down on her like a physical force. The crystal pulsed, its light radiating warmth and dread in equal measure. It was alive, aware, and it seemed to call to her. "What happens if we fail?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elias didn't look up, his focus on the ancient words spilling from his lips. "Failure is not an option. If we don't seal the void, this town, and everything beyond it, will be consumed." The shadow creature roared, shaking the earth beneath their feet. The air around them shimmered as though reality itself was beginning to fray. Vanessa stepped forward, her fingers trembling as they closed around the crystal. The moment her hands touched the crystal, a jolt of energy surged through her body. She gasped, her vision blurring as the world around her dissolved into darkness. Vanessa found herself standing in a vast, empty void. The air was cold, and the ground beneath her feet was insubstantial, like the surface of a frozen lake. In the distance, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the creature, but smaller, more defined. Its burning eyes locked onto hers, and its voice echoed in her mind. "You dare challenge me?" Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. "You're the darkness," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. "I am the end of light, the hunger that binds all things. You cannot defeat me." The void began to close in around her, the shadows pressing against her from all sides. Vanessa gritted her teeth, focusing on the crystal in her hands. Its light cut through the darkness, creating a fragile barrier between her and the entity. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice gaining strength. The darkness laughed, a sound that reverberated through the void like thunder. "You should be." As the entity advanced, images began to flash in Vanessa's mind, memories of Ravenswood's past. She saw the founding families kneeling before the altar, their faces etched with desperation. She saw the shadows rising from the forest, their forms coalescing into something monstrous. And she saw the pact being forged. The townsfolk had offered their shadows, their very connection to light, as a price for safety. But the pact was a lie. The darkness had always intended to consume them, slowly and completely. Vanessa's grip on the crystal tightened. "You tricked them," she said. "You made them believe they were safe. But you were feeding on them all along." The entity paused, its form flickering. "They were mine from the beginning. And now so are you." The crystal in Vanessa's hands began to change, its light dimming and flickering like a dying flame. She realized the entity was trying to extinguish it, to snuff out the last remnant of hope. But as she stared into the crystal, she saw something else, a faint reflection of herself. It wasn't just a tool. It was a mirror, a vessel for her will. Vanessa closed her eyes, focusing on the light within her. She thought of the people of Ravenswood, frozen in fear but still alive. She thought of Elias, risking everything to save them. And she thought of her own journey, her determination to uncover the truth no matter the cost. When she opened her eyes, the crystal blazed with a new light, pure, unyielding, and bright enough to banish the shadows. The entity recoiled, its form unraveling as the light grew stronger. "No!" it roared, its voice filled with fury and fear. Vanessa took a step forward, the crystal held high. "You don't belong here. This town doesn't belong to you." Back in the church, Elias watched in awe as the crystal's light filled the room. The shadow creature writhed and screamed, its form breaking apart under the relentless glow. Vanessa's voice echoed through the void and the physical world alike. "This ends now." With a final burst of light, the crystal shattered, releasing a wave of energy that swept through the town. The shadows dissolved, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. The void collapsed, and Vanessa was thrown back into the real world. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. When she opened her eyes, the church was quiet. The oppressive weight of the darkness was gone, replaced by a peaceful stillness. Elias knelt beside her, a look of relief on his face. "You did it," he said. Vanessa sat up, her body aching but alive. She looked around and saw the townsfolk stirring, their frozen expressions softening as they came back to life. The world outside was no longer bathed in unnatural light. The forest had returned, its trees swaying gently in the breeze. As the sun rose over Ravenswood, Vanessa stood at the edge of the town, looking out at the familiar landscape. The shadows were back, but they were just shadows now, normal, harmless, and natural. Elias joined her, his face lined with exhaustion but also hope. "The town owes you its life," he said. Vanessa shook her head. "They owe it to you. You never gave up on them." Elias smiled faintly. "What will you do now?" Vanessa glanced at the notebook in her hands, its pages filled with everything she had experienced. "Write the story," she said. "People need to know the truth." As she walked away, the town behind her bathed in golden light. Vanessa couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. She had come to Ravenswood seeking a story, and she had found more than she ever imagined. But as she stepped onto the road leading away from the town, a faint shadow flickered at the edge of her vision. For a moment, she thought she heard a whisper. A soft, familiar voice carried on the wind. "We'll be waiting." Vanessa turned, but there was nothing there. With a deep breath, she continued down the road, leaving Ravenswood and its secrets behind.